Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining or coming to the center spotlight from Cherry Hill Seminary. My name is Margot Wolf. I am the academic dean. Today I am taking over for Holly Emore, who is unable to join us due to the hurricane. She is safe, but electricity and Wi-Fi is not available for her at this moment. So we'll be thinking of her. I'm also joined by Jeffrey Kiefer, who is the board president or board chair of Cherry Hill Seminary. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, for joining us as well. And I'd like to introduce to you Chaz Clifton. So Chaz has been a Pagan author for some time. He's the author of Her Hidden Children. He's also the editor of the Pomegranate, which, if you do not know, is a peer-reviewed journal for Pagan studies. He has edited multiple outstanding books. There's the series of the Witchcraft Today. I think there are 4 books in that series, and has observed and documented so many fascinating things in the pagan scene throughout the years, especially in the United States. So we welcome you, Chaz. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Margot and Jeffrey, for stepping up. I know Holly and I had discussed this for some time, and she was not at all happy about being kicked off the internet, so to speak, by Hurricane Helene. So anyway, I'm glad we can carry on.
Absolutely, absolutely. So I've got a series of questions here for you, Chaz, but feel free to navigate wherever you would like to talk. And you've got such lots of fascinating stories to tell. But first, can you talk to us a little bit about your career as a journalist?
Okay, well, yeah, I actually spent the 80s as a journalist. Worked, I owned one small publication. In fact, on the way to my hand fasting, the high priest and I were dropping off copies. It was this free tabloid monthly for the antiques trade. And then I worked at a newspaper, and then I worked in the communications office for Colorado College in Colorado Springs, and then book publisher in Boulder, Colorado, and then back to another newspaper. And about that time, I finished an MA in religious studies and switched over into academia. So I didn't really start in academia per se until I was, oh gosh, late 30s. And yeah, right? Yeah. And but that was all good because it gave me a background in publishing and just the nuts and bolts, which has been helpful in doing books and stuff. And right now I'm speaking to you on the porch of my house in the foothills of the wet mountains in southern Colorado, trying to take advantage of the nice weather instead of setting up in my study with a ring light and all that, because my study is being reorganized and it just looks like a bomb went off in there.
I think a lot of people can say the same thing. We have our books, our studies, our papers surrounding us as we are diving into different things, right? So when did you start becoming more involved with pagans? You said that you had your hand fasting, but what about pagan publishing?
Yeah. Well, let's see. To back up a little bit, I mean, there seems to be a series of typical origin stories as you go back. I mean, some people find it on the internet. Before that, you hear about people saying, "Oh, I was 16 years old and I hung out in Barnes and Noble looking at the occult books." And when I was 16 years old, I had no idea there was no Barnes and Noble, but I had no idea that any of this existed. I mean, Gerald Gardner's books were out there somewhere, but I never saw them. Um, and when I sort of entered a seeker phase, which lasts from about 16 to 21, roughly, um, I knew nothing at all about Western tradition. I mean, like a lot of people, if I looked for something new, I looked east. thought about Buddhism a lot, for example, and went to hear speakers and that kind of stuff. And then one day in a little village outside of Taos, New Mexico, where I'll be in about 4 days, um, I was staying with this guy who was a poet. I was helping him build a house. He had a lot of books. And one evening, he and his girlfriend had gone off on a backpack trip, leaving me alone in their house. And after supper, I poured a glass of wine and I was walking around looking at his bookshelves. And I saw Robert Graves' The White Goddess, which actually dates from 1948, which is, what does he call it? A grammar of poetic myth or something. But anyway, it's a book that gets attacked a lot for bad translations or misunderstanding early Welsh literature and this sort of thing. But nonetheless, the first chapter in that rocked my world because I had always struggled with the fact that whether as a Anglican Christian or as a wannabe Buddhist or whatever, there was always this tension between different parts of my life. Like, the spiritual and the erotic and outdoors and nature and art and all these things. And it seemed like everybody wanted you to drop something, you know. Maybe you couldn't go fishing, maybe you couldn't have sex, whatever the thing was. And suddenly I saw for the first time that there could be a spiritual path, a religious path, even that had room for everything. And that was tremendously important to me at that point in my life, at 21 years old. And so that's when I intellectually became a pagan, just to show you what it was like, of course, down there surrounded by folk Catholics. But I had no idea that there were any others. And for a couple of years, I sort of operated under the premise that, well, if no one else is going to do this religion, I'll do it. I'll leave her some offerings, And then, of course, gradually I began to learn that no, that's not the case. There was already an ecosystem of new pagan movements in America and elsewhere, and this was all happening. But that took me a couple of years to really get a feel for it. So yeah, by the time I did get married, I was in a coven, and my wife also, and yeah, we did that. We had the last barefoot hippie Wiccan wedding.
So what one of the questions that we have is about the pomegranate, and you said that you didn't start the pomegranate, but you are currently the editor. When did that transition happen?
Well, to go back one farther step, in the 1980s, when I was in grad school, or just before I started grad school, I really liked the whole zine publishing scene, and I'm glad it's having a little bit of a revival. I started my own zine called Iron Mountain, the Journal of Magical Religion, if you can read the subtitle. And I actually had professional typesetting, which I did. So it was partly literary, partly academic, partly journalistic. And I did all of 4 issues, a couple hundred of them. And one of them came into the hands of a guy I got to know later named Fritz Mentine, who was an old Bay Area pagan who had gotten into the scene in the 60s, later moved to British Columbia, had a career as a builder and architect and a furniture maker. And also finally, as he was winding down all of that, decided to go to graduate school and study religion. And so he started his own zine, much slicker, called The Pomegranate. And he called it originally a journal of neo-pagan thought, and then later we called it Pagan Studies. And he was doing it pretty much as a in the format of an academic journal with articles and reviews. And so he asked me to help him. We got to know each other around 2000, somewhere in there. And we'd always sort of known of each other. And he asked me to help him. And so I did. And then I started pressuring him, let's go legit. Let's get a publisher. Let's be a real peer-reviewed journal. And I remember in 2001 walking around the huge book show at the American Academy of Religion meeting, looking for publishers who might take us on. And I'll skip all the details, but we ended up with a new company called Equinox, which is headquartered in Sheffield in England. And they took us on, and we are now a real journal, indexed, available online through various services, and publishing twice a year when we can keep up. I say we, it's mostly me with one associate editor, Carolyn Tully, University of Melbourne in Australia, but she's off in Italy doing research right now. So it's mostly me and a board of directors, editorial board, I mean. And I think Pomegranate has been a good thing. I think we've really tried to help build pagan studies as an identifiable discipline. And in parallel with that was a long struggle starting in about 95 and lasting until 2005 to become a program unit within the American Academy of Religion, which is a big learned society, thousands of members. And it has many, many program units that are all split up according to their interest. Most of those they might be something like religion and psychology, or they might be something like, many different varieties of studies of Christianity, Islam, Buddhism, and so on. The big five, So it took us 10 years to make enough noise and demonstrate our sincerity that we could get to be a program unit of our own, which I think is something that I worked on, Graham Harvey worked on it, Michael York, former academic dean there, Wendy Griffin was a powerhouse, Sarah Pike from Cal State Chico, bunch of people. And so that's been wonderful. So having the program unit makes a place for public discussion of pagan studies, at least within the academy. Of course, there are conferences and what have you in other countries as well. The AAR isn't the only game. But anyway, the Pomegranate has been a big part of my life. And now I'm trying to get more people involved so I don't have to do quite so much.
So what are you looking for people to do? I'm suspecting obviously contribute or send their contributions in.
We need writers all the time, and I'll be happy to talk about that later. And then we basically, for another associate editor, we need somebody with probably somebody with an academic position, good contacts, and a good ability to read and evaluate papers that come in, which is something you do if you manage graduate students. And of course, it wouldn't hurt if you have a well-thumbed copy of the Chicago Manual of Style.
Of course. So I wanted to switch topics just a little bit and talk about Her Hidden Children.
Yeah.
What prompted that whole exploration?
That was the book that I wrote because I had boxes and boxes of correspondence and zines and stuff from the 70s, 80s, 90s. And I'm not by any means claiming that it's the definitive history of American paganism or anything like that. I know there's parts I've left out, but I wanted to try to get a story down about, as it says, the rise of Wicca and paganism in America, and just get these things down before it was too late. Tell some of the stories, show some of the lines of thinking, like, for example, the term nature religion, you know, that had been tossed around, especially in the 90s, a lot. Um, but within the academy, we discovered that there were two different takes on nature religion operating. One was theistic and one was non-theistic. Obviously, we were on the theistic side. And I wanted to try to sit down and take a chapter and say, what does that mean to say you're a nature religion? And I came up with a little schema of three kinds of nature religion: cosmic, Gaian, and embodied or erotic, and tried to sort things into those categories. But mainly, yeah, it was just wanting to get some stories down while some of the history of this development while we could. Um, I knew I couldn't do everything. I didn't want to do a journalistic survey like
Wait.
uh, Flying to the Moon was.
Oh, is this your immune thing?
Excuse me.
Hold on a second. We got make sure we get everyone muted here.
It-
Okay, we're good. Go ahead.
okay, so anyway, long story short, I just wanted to there had been a number of journalistic surveys of the American scene. Susan Roberts, which is USA, Margot Adler's Drawing Down the Moon. In fact, I even made a little spreadsheet once and took several of these books and compared them and noticed how they frequently talk to the same people. But that's because there were not too many out people to talk to back then. But I wanted to be a little more theoretical than that, to try to at least put up a crude theoretical framework that the new pagan movement could be discussed. And so let's see here, refresh my own memory. So talking about, for example, Wicca and popular culture, talking about self-invention versus tradition, um, and talking about the struggles just over the W word in particular, over the word witch, and who gets to define that. Now, Ronald Hutton has done that hugely, in his last book, but I wanted to bring it up. So anyway, this book's 20 years old now. Some things have changed. A lot of things have happened. It's by no means definitive, but I'm still more or less pleased with it.
What have you seen over that has developed or has evolved over the 20 years since you've published?
Well,
Volume?
I'm going to be talking two sides of the same issue here.
That's fine. Go for
When I
it.
first became involved, let's say, more in the 80s, I think of 1980 as being kind of a watershed year because if I can remember correctly, that was the year of the first big national pagan outdoor festival. And there had been others before, but they had either been small and informal or they had been hotel type cons, conventions. The Church of Wicca did one starting in the 70s, for example. But sort of the rise of the festival movement, which unfortunately took a blow from COVID like so much else. And also there was, lots more people seeking, and they're still seeking, institutionalization to some extent, to creating organizations. Um, and this is, I think, is particularly American because in America, you don't need anybody's permission to start a church, unlike some countries. And I think that inventing churches kind of a form of folk art for us. Everybody does it. It's like
Jeffrey laughing. Definitely.
it's like, let's start a band, let's start a church. Um, and so we have in our country, we've had a lot of jurisprudence and about First Amendment rights and what you can do and what you can't. We've had organizations like the Universal Life Church, God bless them, which was basically how to use a church as a tax dodge. So there was, I think, a rush to institutionalization, which may or may not have been a good idea, but it's a learning experience. Does your coven need a bank account? Ours did for a while. But on the other hand, pagan groups are not necessarily very long lived. They go through a lot of changes. So I'm not sure now. I think this is something that someone should come back and study. Is this move towards institutionalization still strong? Has it been moderated by other factors? That's a good religious studies question. I'd like to know the answer to that. And then, of course,
Maka, who mentions Covenant of Goddess is about to is turning 50.
yeah, that's an example of a sort of meta group, a group of groups that has indeed lasted over a number of years, and there aren't too many like it. But as I said, I wonder how in an environment in which we're constantly being told that that institutional religion is losing ground, believe it, if you want to accept that. What about our kind of institutionalization? Pardon me, my voice is a little rough. So anyway, then of course, then people talk about, I don't know if I even want to, the influence of social media is huge. What I was saying to Margot earlier before we started was that there were influencers before there was social media. We didn't use the term influencer, but individuals like Sybil Leek, the English witch who moved to America and became a celebrated ghost hunter and what have you. Or there's this woman we were talking about named Louise Hubner who got herself named official witch of Los Angeles County in the 60s and rode that pony as far as she could to help publicize her own business. And there was another Los Angeles occult shop owner who got herself a layout in Penthouse magazine, again, for, help, before there was TikTok, before there was OnlyFans or any of that, what's her name was doing it only in print. So, this kind of phenomenon of the entrepreneurial witch, or what Ronald Hutton would call a service magician, but with a lot of flair to it. It's been around a while and is always at tension somewhat with the people who prefer more devotionally oriented practice.
That is an interesting trend back to a question that we have is looking at those trends that we've seen over the past 20 years and how as things have shifted, they've also remained the same. You still have influencers, they're just in a different sphere. You still have that back and forth between the institutionalism of paganism and how that should look, how it shouldn't look, and even how as Cherry Hill is trying to find their way in that regard.
Yeah, I think this would be an absolutely central question for Cherry Hill. I hear some people from an older generation of Wiccan leadership telling me you know, people that, well, young people are afraid to start a coven, afraid of the responsibility, afraid their people might not like each other. I'm not quite sure exactly what's always meant, but in fact, I was suggesting to one friend of mine that in a city where there is a bit of a sort of a old school high priestess network, is that they start classes. J.D. Harrow wrote a book 20 some years ago, basically on, how to run how do you have a coven? How does that work? But not everybody wants covens. I mean, there are many other organizational models, but that's just one. It's really hard for us because we're always in tension with the Judeo-Christian Islamic model of what a religion looks like, which is that you have a special building, and every 7 days you get together in this special building, and the special guy, usually it's a guy, explains the special book to you. And that's what people think of when they think of religion. And of course, there are other models. There have always been other models. I've never been to Japan, but from what I understand, Shinto still preserves a model that's probably would have been familiar in the ancient European world of, the priest serves the shrine. You can go to the shrine if you want to. Don't go if you don't want to. Go on a festival. Go when you have a special request. But the shrine will be there. Or things I have noticed from attending some native powwows and festivals and stuff, like in New Mexico. Things happen that are spiritually significant, religiously significant. Not everybody participates. Some people are participating, some people are watching intently, some people are off in the corner, trying to chat up a potential romantic partner or something. Probably much the way medieval cathedrals operated. But I think that pagans of all kinds are kind of always having to struggle against the model of the 7-day week in the Holy Book.
Sure, sure. And I think also part of it, having the resources, so many covens, pagan groups, hearths, whatever, they meet at someone's house.
Yeah.
Or they're able to rent out space at a church or a UU, and having those resources, but not having the resource for themselves, makes it tricky. I wanted to switch topics a little bit. Mentioned a little bit in the beginning about how you would advise someone who might be interested in pagan studies or pagan history, and how you recommend they would proceed with that.
Okay, well, don't go to graduate school and thinking you're going to do pagan studies. For one thing, it will be very, very difficult to find professors who know what you're talking about. There are some, obviously, I can rattle off some names. But it's not like there's jobs in pagan studies out there. Unless, if you want to be a scholar of religions, you've got to make yourself more of a generalist. I mean, a lot of people, like, for example, we mentioned Wendy Griffin. She came in via sociology and women's studies. And she was certainly a scholar of paganism too, but she brought to it the tools that she learned as a sociologist, or you could say with the tools you learn as a historian, like Ronald Hutton, who is very definite about saying that he's not a religion guy. Is this where I bring up Jeff Kripal in that book?
Sure, sure.
Okay. I have this blog out there called Letter from Hardscrabble Creek. You can find it at blog.chesclifton.com. And I just recently did a post about this book. Okay. The Supernatural, co-written by Whitley Strieber of Communion fame and Jeff Kripal. Now, Jeff Kripal is a religious studies professor at Rice University in Houston, although recently I think they've kicked him up to being an associate dean. And I think he's one of the best people out there when it comes to writing about scholars interacting with esoteric and paranormal and generally weird stuff. And the son of a gun writes a new book about every 2 years, so it's hard to keep up with. This one is several years old. Anyway, so this was a book in which Whitley Strieber talked about paranormal stuff, and in alternating chapters, Kripal would talk about it from a religious studies perspective. And I had started to read it once. This was all in the blog post. And I hit a part that was so strange to me at that time, this was about 5 years ago, that I just put it back. I just put it down. I just put it on the shelf. I thought, even though I'd been around the block a few times, some of this was just too brain stretching. So I pulled it out again. Well, first, actually, what happened was I pulled it out to show a part to my wife, and the book disappeared, literally. It was like almost like somebody took it out of my hand. We have a problem in this house with I don't know. We have little invisible friends who sometimes steal shiny objects. This is the one and only time a book has gone missing. And we both looked for it. I mean, we were crawling around on the floor in the bedroom, which is where it was in the bedroom shelves. We were crawling around on the floor with flashlights. We couldn't find it. So I had to say to the little guys, the cousins, that you have your tricks, but are you stronger than Jeff Bezos? And I got a copy from Amazon, and it stayed around. Anyway, still haven't got a copy. Still. But anyway, the point is, I got to rereading it from the scratch, and I realized what Jeff Kripal was doing on his side was that he was conducting sort of a master class in how do you write about paranormal stuff as a scholar. And he comes up with a whole schemata of, there's this approach, this approach, this approach. And then he helpfully puts it in the back of the book as an appendix so you can have it all in one place. And I said, like, my God, this guy is, handing you a few pages on this is how you can write about stuff without being without being what some people call very negatively a curator. In other words, curators are people who write about their subject matter, this group, this culture, whatever, in a very protective way. Like, I'm going to explain how wonderful they are, and I'm going to defend them against anybody who would say anything negative. They're like, my little collection.
Mhm.
And the opposite of that, of course, is the critic, not critic in a negative way, but the critic is someone who can make what Kripal calls the hermeneutical cut and step outside and look in. So anyway, I'm now going around recommending to everybody that they read The Supernatural just for Kripal's, if nothing else, for Kripal's chapters on how to write about this stuff. Okay, that's a digression. Anyway, if you're going to do pagan studies, it's a tiny niche field, and what you really need to do is do something bigger. Be a historian of religion, and by the way, do some stuff on paganism. Study issues of religion and something else, like religion and the environment, or whatever. And by the way, include pagans. That would be my advice. If you want to be an academic and you want to get hired. Because I look at all the people who have done stuff in this field, and we all started out as something else. Graham Harvey started out working with Judaism more. And now he's Mr. Animism, but it took him a long time to get there, or Dr. Animism, I should say. Ronald Hutton was a historian of 17th century Britain and the English Civil War and all that, Stuart Dynasty. In fact, Hutton once told me that he felt that publishing Triumph of the Moon killed his chance to be offered a job at Oxford University because it was too weird.
I did hear that story, yeah.
Yeah, I think he later put it into a book. If he had stayed with the 17th century and the Stuart Kings, he would have been fine. It's all right. He's done all right for himself anyway. He just wanted that one last feather in his cap, but then he got plenty of other honors. So yeah, if I look at some of the other books we published, okay, this book, Being Viking, Heathenism in Contemporary America, which we published in our Equinox Pagan Studies series. And I think it's a great book on heathenism. I'd put it over Matthias Gardell or Stephanie von Schnurbein or Jennifer Snook, because it's not just concentrating on, oh, heathens are scary and probably Nazis, something like that kind of thing. It's a much broader view. And again, it's got history, it's got theory. It examines the controversial parts, but in a calm way, not in a sensationalist way. And the guy who did it teaches at a small, very conservative Christian university in Appalachia. In fact, he almost got in trouble for writing that book. I guess he was called into the dean's office or something and said, "You better never mention the name of this university in conjunction with the book." Or the one that just came out this week, Spider Dance, Tradition, Time, and Healing in Southern Italy, is done by an anthropologist, Giovanna Parmigianni, and she's currently at Harvard Divinity School right now, but she's trained in anthropology, and that, ethnography, that's what she does. And so that's the way she goes in. But then she also gets involved with a lot of the anthropology of magic. And there's been quite a bit published on the anthropology of magic going back to, I don't know, Bruno Malinowski decades and decades ago, over a century ago. Because most religion scholars traditionally were involved with book religions, it was up to the anthropologists to do the magic and the indigenous stuff, right? So she comes out of that tradition, but it's a study of a small pagan group in southern Italy, in Salento, and what she's looking for is not just description and not just ethnography, but also ideas about how they think about time in a magical way. You hear a lot of discussion about diviner's time or magical time, different kinds of time, and that's what really her interest is. It's also the first book I've ever worked on that has its own soundtrack, but I'm really happy with it. Hope it wins the prize. So yeah, if anybody who wanted to go farther into pagan studies, first you've got to have a bunch of arrows in your quiver, because pagan studies is not that big, but it benefits from being a venue for people with different kinds of theoretical backgrounds, like anthropology or sociology or history of religion or literature, what have you.
Gotcha. So I'm just looking at a couple of the comments that we have here. Murphy Pizza got her grant to study local pagans. That was in Minneapolis and St. Paul, and a lot of our faculty at Cherry Hill are, obviously their studies, their work in other areas, women's studies, general religious studies, anthropology, and so forth. So absolutely, that's, that broader scope is what, as far as employment, you need to have that. Um, if you're focusing just not just, but you're focusing on narrowing down or the studies of pagans, whether it be a historical perspective or something that we see right now in 2024, particularly with a lot of the social media. Is there any advice that you would give someone as they're starting to do research or they're continuing to do their research?
Well, I think most advisors would say, you've got to have some big questions you want to ask. And like I said, with her hidden children, probably my driving question was, what do you mean by nature religion? Um, and so what you need something like that to drive your approach. How are they doing this, or how are they coping with this? Now, with pagan studies, I originally started out as kind of a new religious movements guy because there was no such thing as pagan studies, and unfortunately, in academia, new religious movements is always kind of a redheaded stepchild. I mean, it really doesn't get the respect it should because they don't have 2,000 years of history and lots of holy books because you're talking about new stuff by definition. But what's it going? Anyway, the you need to have. Oh, okay, I know where I was headed with this. With new religious movements, there's a lot of writing, which is essentially what I call scouting, in the sense of, there are these strange people over there, and you're going to go find out how many of them are there. What are they doing? Are they friendly? Are they hostile? You know, and where'd they come from? Who are their leaders? Those kind of questions. And lately, Pomegranate's been getting a lot of articles from Eastern Europe in particular, where people are writing articles on those kinds of questions. Are they neo-Nazis? Or this or that. We have an article coming in the next issue, which is going to be out sometime in October, I hope, where somebody is looking at comparing the two most visibly quasi-pagan military units on the Ukrainian and Russian armies in the current war. There are both. There are pagans. There are identified pagans on both sides in that fight.
Mm-hmm.
And in some cases, this has been used. Surprise, surprise! This has been used against them. Every time you hear someone on the Russian side saying Ukraine's full of Nazis and so on, what they're mostly talking about is this one group, the Azov Brigade, which are, some of whom are indeed native faith Ukrainian pagans who follow the pantheon the same as you'd find in pretty much all the Slavic countries. That doesn't make them political Nazis, but that's a quick and easy way to smear mud on them.
Sure.
So that's the kind of, I was so happy to see that paper come in because I had been thinking about that and wishing somebody would do it. I know scholars from outside Russia who have worked on Russian paganism. I had one friend in Russia who had been working on it, and because he's in his 30s, he ran for the border when the war started, so he wouldn't get drafted. So that saved his butt, but he's not in a good position to do academic work. He had been at an institution in St. Petersburg. Um, in fact, I'll never forget, I was editing an article on a Ukrainian pagan organization in February 2022. And I had just sent the final edits back to the author, who was a professor in Kiev. And boom, the invasion happened. I didn't know if she was alive or dead. She's alive, fortunately. But so it's been a topic close to my heart, and I'm glad to see we're going to be finally publishing something on it. So there's something else you can do. The intersection between paganism and some big event like this. Good place to start, especially for a historian.
That's some good advice. Thank you. So one of the questions that Holly asked me to ask you was about some of your favorite stories. As as you've been going through, your research and your writing and many of your editing projects, what are some of your most interesting stories?
Well, I did do that, as you mentioned briefly. One of the many things I've done was the series I did in the early '90s for Llewellyn called Witchcraft Today. This was one of them. This was the fourth and last of the series. And it was supposed to be a bit longer, but back then Llewellyn was still kind of Midwest conventional. I had one woman, a friend of mine from Albuquerque, who was writing on basically how do you know when it's magic, or how do you know if it's not just mental illness? She was speaking from experience. I had Patricia Keneally Morrison, the late Patricia Keneally Morrison, who was married to Jim Morrison of the Doors. And she was what nowadays you hear called a God spouse. Only most people, I guess they're mostly women, but some men who are God spouses consider themselves married to a being, but she was, of course, married to Jim Morrison, who was very much human with all his ups and downs, but nevertheless, she considered him to be an avatar of Dionysus. And so the first the first sentence of her essay was, "I was married to a god." And the editors at Llewellyn just couldn't handle that. So that one got struck. Yet they offered me a job. But nowadays you could probably publish that. I mean, Llewellyn has changed. Okay. They're not the same outfit they were in the '90s. So that's all good.
Yeah.
And then, okay, here's one small story that goes back to my journalism days. Holly was curious about this, and I just mentioned it to Margot earlier. In 1980, a murder occurred outside the little Texas panhandle town of Dumas, or Dimmitt, excuse me, not Dumas. Dumas is another town. This is Dimmitt, between Dimmitt and Hereford, where a bunch of local teenagers on Halloween were driving around the rural roads, and one of the things they wanted to do was go see the witch's house. And the witches in question were Loy and Louise Stone, who were like the #2 couple in the Church of Wicca organization, which is now, I guess it's gone. But it was controversial in its time. And they had 2 adult daughters who were both college students living in Amarillo at that time. And so because they lived within couple hours drive of Amarillo, they organized the Church of Wicca annual Samhain seminars, it was called, which was a hotel con, small one, for all kinds of magical practitioners. And they usually had them in either Amarillo or Albuquerque simply because it was convenient for them. Amarillo, both of those places were good for me because I could be there in a day. So it was that particular year, it ended on the 31st, on October 31st. And my wife and I had coffee at the Howard Johnson's or whatever it was, coffee shop. And then we headed north and they headed back down to Dimmitt. And anyway, so they lived on this farmstead. They owned the land around it, but leased it out for cotton. And it was their house, Loy's mother's house, a big machine shed, some other outbuildings. And so anyway, these kids go out there. And now what happened is kind of confusing. They said that somebody shot at them. This 15-year-old girl who was riding in the passenger seat of this pickup. She was actually, I think, sitting in her boyfriend's lap because they had like 4 kids in the front seat. And she was struck and severely wounded and taken to the hospital in Dimmitt, where she died. And this uh, this really marked a kind of break in the Wiccan community because there were plenty of people who were saying, well, Church of Wicca, they deserve what they get. They're nasty. And actually, I felt that Loy and Louise were 2 of the nicest and most generous people I knew. I considered them to be like an extra aunt and uncle. I mean, they basically lived off land rents so that they could spend all their time studying parapsychology. And he had a counseling practice, and she was an industrial photographer. But so there were a lot of people who were on their side who didn't want to believe that they could possibly have done this. And one of the things I had in my files that I had gotten from partly from my own saving of stuff and partly stuff sent to me by the Stones was a whole notebook full of people's psychic impressions about what really happened, who really did it. It really happened somewhere else, you know. It happened somewhere else, and people are just trying to blame it on the Stones. Anyway, there was a murder trial. It got even more complex because there was an ethnic angle. The girl who was killed was Hispanic. Stones were Anglos, of course. Both of them came from families who had been in that area a long time. And one of the things I got later from the daughter was they hired first of all a high-powered lawyer, a former president of the Texas Defensive Bar Association, Texas Defense Bar. And this lawyer hired an investigator out of Amarillo who left copious notes, which were very interesting to read. And finally, what it really came down to was 2 things: a lack of clear identification and the fact that it was 45 minutes from when the kids said that the shot had been fired to when they drove up to the emergency room at the hospital. Now I've driven that, and you can do it in 20 minutes and stay under the speed limit. I mean, it's the Texas Panhandle. It's just absolutely one straight road, one turn, and another straight road into Dimmitt. And so there was this weird missing time thing. Plus, it was a shotgun, so there's no ballistics, at least not in the 80s. So basically, what this high-priced defense attorney was able to do was to create enough confusion the prosecution narrative didn't stand up. He just threw a lot of dust in the air, that so that the jury could say that they couldn't be sure beyond a reasonable doubt, So Lloyd got off. It bankrupted him. They had to sell all their land. The stress, I think, killed him a year later. He died of a heart attack. Of course, he was a big, kind of beefy guy in his 50s. He might have looked like the type to get a heart attack. But that to me was one of the most interesting cases. And I had all this stuff on it, all these notes. And I finally, somebody I knew was guest editing an issue of a journal called the Journal of Religion and Violence. And so I proposed that I would do an article on this because one of the things, that came up in it was the fact that these people were self-proclaimed witches. In fact, I was working at the Colorado Springs Sun newspaper at the time, and I was following the coverage. Heck, even the New York Times did an article on this trial. This was how big it was. They sent somebody clear out to Texas Panhandle. And I kept noticing the phrase self-proclaimed witch. And I thought, haven't we moved beyond that? And so I called the United Press International office in Dallas, where the stories were coming out of. And I said, what's with this? And they said, oh, well, if we don't put self-proclaimed in there, then it's the term is libelous. In other words, to call somebody a witch is still, as far as their style book was concerned, a libel. So it had to always be self-proclaimed. Anyway,
I think that's still the case now.
Yeah, I think it was probably at least in some media outlets it is, because the term witch is still so ambiguous.
Right.
Hutton tries to promote service magician, but every time he says service magician, I see somebody in coveralls with zippers and snaps and Gandalf above the pocket. Should be sliding under your car. So anyway, I did an article finally a few years ago, and I was glad to see it finally published. And the Stones' surviving daughter read it, and she said that was a good treatment of the story. So that was the thing is, that wasn't the only case of this sort of thing that was happening back then. There were a number of cases of witches and other pagans trying to, go back to the land or what have you, and being hassled, having it turned into a legend trip, as they say in folklore studies, especially about that time of year. It happened to people I know in Colorado. And there was even a little shooting back and forth in which fortunately no one was hurt. So, this was just one that went all the way.
It's in that was in, you said that was that 1980?
1980 was when the shooting occurred. Yeah.
So in looking back, and especially in the United States, the satanic panic that was also very prevalent.
Yeah, that was getting cranked up then, wasn't it? Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it was, there was more journalism about this stuff. And I'll never forget, for example, that, in the case of the Stones, one of the daughters had painted an Eye of Horus Egyptian design on their mother's house. And of course, that was seized upon by all the high school kids as a sign of something else. And also, one of the houses had I think it had a screen door with a metal initial on it, built into the door, which was S for stone. But of course, the kids were saying that's S for Satan.
Sure.
So I have personal experience too. I know these things can go out of hand real fast.
Oh, absolutely.
And pretty soon it's bam, bam.
As we're looking forward, like, do you see those types of incidents, or those maybe not to that extreme, but those are still prevalent in the culture that people misinterpret.
It can still happen, sure. Um, I don't think it's happening as much. And that's because I think that there is a more and more of an acceptance of what you could call pagan ideas in the culture. It's just sort of how you present yourself. It's a very complicated picture, and I'm collecting materials right now for at least a series of blog posts. Maybe I'll do a paper um, on, and this is connected to the whole idea of reenchantment, which is a very popular notion right these days about bringing well, just the material. But there are a number of influential Christian writers talking about paganism.
Mhm.
And let me tell you, folks, it's just like the same discourse from the 4th century. It's the all your gods are demons kind of thing. And there's this pagan menace, that's that's going to be the final death of Christianity if we don't stop it. And of course, there's online nastiness. I mean, there's some accounts on X, formerly Twitter, that are nothing but telling pagans they're all a bunch of LARPers, and by the way, your gods don't exist, this kind of thing.
Sure. We definitely see a lot of that in social media,
Mhm.
trying to discredit people who are in pagan studies.
Mm.
In your experiences, is there a particular line of or area of inquiry in these pagan experiences or practices that you think is most needed right now?
Well, that's a good question. I think it depends where you are. Like I said, the Eastern European folks are still trying to kind of figure out the playing board, so to speak, who's where and what are there and how many of them are there. Um, I think there's a lot to be done with paganism and popular media, to be sure, popular culture. Um, and again, I want to go back to Kripal for a second. Jeff Kripal is fond of saying things like, for example, to understand the whole UFO phenomenon, we need better science fiction stories, because he holds that the phenomenon, capital P, operates in relationship to the pictures we have in our heads, our imaginal world. And so, and like you think of like 1950s, 1960s flying saucer movies where the saucer comes down and there's lots of fire and smoke, and then they drop the ladder and out comes the alien guy, If that's what's in your imagination, well, guess what happens? You have one of these anomalous experiences, and that's kind of what you see. Um, but there's this very complex interaction between culture and experience. Um, I've always, been fascinated by the way that um, paganism has developed in relation to novels. That we lacking a living model, at least in some countries, or an accessible model would be a better way to put it. Um, People tend to create what they're doing in relationship to fiction. And I know, this is pretty common. My first Coven's reading list was heavy on authors like Alan Garner, some others I have to stop and think about to come up with, who wrote books in which, fantasy books basically, are in which the you can sort of find some inspiration. it's like, of course, the classic example is the movie The Wicker Man. You know, in the 80s, everybody was running around saying, you got to see this, you got to see this. Just ignore the last couple of minutes. That's not really right, but you got to see this. um, and so that, you know, that movie, which was supposed to be a horror movie, became sort of, you know, part of the canon as far as the pagans were concerned.
I've heard the same thing with the Matrix series, the movie the Matrix, and how people have pulled that in as part of their religious framework somehow.
Yeah, I would say that I've only seen the first one, and I would say that it's powerfully Gnostic, but I'm not a Gnostic really in the final analysis, but it
Mm.
certainly has that vibe to it.
Yeah.
Totally. Um, so yeah, and then of course, what complicates it even further is when someone decides that an author is unacceptable. I mean, the classic example being Mists of Babylon,
Mhm.
which right now I see people think, oh, well, you know, I enjoyed that book, but now I can't read it. Or someone else would say, oh, I read it, but there was always something about it that put me off. Um, I didn't hear that at all when it first came out. But anyway, yeah, so the relationship between works of art and religion, I think, is huge.
Sure.
Not that the religion inspires the works of art, but to the extent to which the works of art inspire the religion.
That's a
And
really good point. You know, it's seeing how, and I'm seeing some of the comments in the chat. Stranger in a Strange Land was the inspiration of the
of course,
Children
yeah.
of Worlds and things like that. So yeah, we're starting to see uh, that relationship between the fiction and the faith.
But yeah, Stranger in a Strange Land is obviously the classic example. But there are so many others that have also played similar works. And, you know, or you have authors like Dion Fortune who put into novels things that she couldn't put into her regular teaching because they were just culturally um, a little rich for her students.
Sure.
I mean, a little too diverse. um, her students were ready for the guild of the Master Jesus. They weren't ready for the worship of Pan outright.
Right. Very good point. Yeah, you find a way to get the material.
Well, that's an unending area of interest, I think. And again, it's for the most of the people in religious studies are always dealing with fields in which, you know, there is the guy, you know,
Mm.
the Buddha, the prophet, whatever. And one of the arguments that I tried to make in Her Hidden Children a little bit was that pagan religions aren't like that. You know, we don't have a guy or a gal, and when we do, we spend all our time talking smack about them.
True.
And you know, but what we have is this organic, you know, lots of little things coming up and stuff arriving, you know, seeds being blown in by the wind or something.
Mhm.
And there's no one thing you can look at and really always say this is it. I mean, you can say that Gerald Gardner was the guy, but then in many respects he wasn't, and he had people, his own students, some of whom who vehemently disagreed with him in his own lifetime. I mean, you know, he only had 15 years of, you know, productive work as a major person in Wicca. Um, but
I
you know,
actually think that's what drives people to the paths is that they can question, they
and they,
can argue, they can explore
you know,
more.
like what I said about, you know, America, we create music like songwriting, or we create religions like, you know, writing a song. I mean, yeah, the creativity of paganism is something that, you know, has gotten some attention, should continue to get more attention. Um, um, the whole idea of unverifiable personal gnosis,
Sure.
which was a term of abuse among the heathenry for a while. I think it's kind of losing its sting now, but if it wasn't in the lore, it's not real. Well, other types of paganism don't have the lore, so you can pretty much do what you like.
Yeah. Find ways to fill those gaps.
Yeah.
That is personal and meaningful. Yeah. So what advice would you give people who maybe have never written in academia? What advice could you give them, or things to stay away from as they're trying to explore their writing?
For academic writing, I probably have two pieces of advice. One is, before you think about writing for a journal, read several issues cover to cover, because you're kind of stepping into a party that's ongoing, and you sort of want to know what the things that are being talked about are. So don't propose an article that's just like what we did last year,
Sure.
Another thing is that the anthropologist Clifford Geertz, who was a pretty sharp guy about writing, said, the essence is that you have to say something about something. In other words, you're not writing an encyclopedia entry. I see a lot of undergrad papers are more like what I call encyclopedia entries, in which they're just trying to define something.
Mhm.
It's static. It's not moving. It's not taking a position. To take a position would be to say, well, okay, like that other article I just mentioned, I don't have it in front of me, that to say that there are self-identified pagans in both the Russian and Ukrainian armies. What's similar, what's different about the way they're received? Okay, or the way they're talked about.
Mhm.
Or in the story about the Loystone murder trial, to me the interesting thing was not who done it, but how did the rest of the Wiccan community, such as it was then, respond to this? On one side there was disdain, on the other side there was this outpouring of support and magical help and what have you. So you've got to have something that you're trying to be persuasive about. Another catchphrase of academic writing is the phrase "mind the gap," which I know means one thing on British trains, but mind the gap in this case means look for something that hasn't been talked about. How come nobody's ever connected X and Q before? I'll do that. That's a way to get attention.
That makes sense. You mentioned something you were previously talking about, the first pagan festival.
Uh,
And COVID really did a number on gatherings.
right.
But it's something that I saw starting to happen before that fewer and fewer people were attending certain gatherings, and wondering what had shifted. Um,
Yeah, that's a good. I've thought about that too. Now, one that I used to go to all the time, um, the organizing group, small group, made the classic mistake. They were all basically younger baby boomers. Um, they put this thing on from the late 80s into at least 20 years. This festival, it was always deliberately capped at 100 adults, but they didn't train their own replacements. And so when they got tired of doing it or had health problems or whatever, they just shut it down, which I was very sad about. There's another festival here in Colorado, however, that's ongoing. It's had a little more formal structure, and it is still continuing. And there's another new one that's been started up, which I've never been to. But so you have to you have to establish a little bit of a structure that can continue. That's not just dependent on a couple people.
Yeah. Definitely when you're talking about I think that's not just in paganism, but society wise, we don't tend to train our replacements. We think that we're going to be able to carry on forever, and as Maka mentions, that age, infirmity move the festivals, the outdoor camping festivals, more into the hotel arena, which makes it a little bit more pricey too. And
Then
then
I think you can still have outdoor camping festivals. It may be, I mean, another effect of COVID, we've certainly seen this in Colorado, is this sudden surge of people into the outdoors. A few years ago, I was hearing lamentations from the National Park Service that people don't visit the national parks as much as they used to. And now, let me tell you, they're swamped. Places like Glacier National Park in Montana, they've had to have, in Rocky Mountain in Colorado, they started having to have quotas. You will be admitted between 9 and 10 o'clock. Otherwise, you'll be turned away.
Mhm.
Um, it's there's we saw this. I know certainly around here um, during all this lockdown crap, people were so eager to get out and go for a walk or go cross country skiing or bicycling or what have you, that all these things were just taking off. So there are people who can do outdoor festivals if they learn how to do them.
Mhm.
I mean, nowadays, if I were running a festival, which is the last thing I'll ever be doing, I'd have YouTube videos, hi, this is how you pack for the festival.
Oh, that's smart. Yeah.
Hey, they just, put the information out there. Don't expect people to just know it. Um, and I would ease I would, make it more accessible in those ways. Now, some people can't do that anymore. And for them, maybe they get to be in the RV, over in the RV lot or what have
Absolutely. And then even with the hotel cons, lots of issues associated with that, pricing, being priced out of the market and so forth. It might not be just that. Is there a phenomenon of the content that is presented that is causing the downturn?
you. Yeah, I don't know. I've been to some great hotel cons. I haven't been to one real recently.
Mhm.
I think that's a model that, deserves to be there too, because there's some things that are easier done indoors. But I think it's important for people to have the outdoor experience and the feedback and just the vibes.
Sure.
Um, I used to go to a festival in New Mexico called Enchanted Mountain, which was held at a big Forest Service campground in the Jemez Mountains. And I had experiences there which were very moving. And it was just, it was just the everything, the not only being with a bunch of, other pagans, but, bonfires and dancing and lights and stars and sweat lodges and the whole thing, which you couldn't very well do in a hotel.
Exactly. It definitely has a different feel to it. You feel, I think, from my experiences alone, that it's more immersive.
Yeah, immersive is a good word. You get instant feedback. And you get occasional disasters, floods or hailstorms or something.
I've been to one where there was a very small, short touchdown of a tornado.
Hmm.
So it's It was not, yeah, it was quite a interesting phenomenon being in the middle of a field and running to try to find shelter. So I wanted to open up to Jeffrey if he had anything else he wanted to ask or to add to the conversation. We'll give you a few moments to see if there's anything else that you wanted to talk about.
Thank you, Margot. Thank you, Chaz. This was just fascinating. And I know that some of the questions that I had coming in, we've meandered all over the place, and I think that that's just so wonderful on how the talk about history and how that merges into pagan studies and looking forward and looking back. I just thought that that was just so incredibly helpful. So I actually don't have any other questions because in so many ways you seem to cover almost all of it. And I know that it led to a very, very active set of discussions in the chat with sharing resources and whatnot. So this was just very, very rich. Thank you.
Yeah, I haven't tried to follow the chat at all. I just couldn't do that and talk. Yeah. I'll maybe look at it in the recording.
Absolutely. Is there anything else that you wanted to share with us, Chaz, before we close for the day?
Gosh. Yes, I should have the profound wrap-up statement. Yeah. One of the things, I'll throw in one more trend thing, which I think will be significant. I think I mentioned Graham Harvey before, who has the book called On Animism, which has now become sort of a classic. I think the big difference between when I started and now is that I see, this isn't true of everybody, because especially people who are operating within a Reconstructionist framework, but I see perhaps less emphasis on pantheons and more on localities and animism and just being local. I think that, all shamanism is local, all paganism is local, which is sort of a tautology if you look at the origin of the word. And I think the best thing people can do is, is check any tendency towards grandiosity and wanting to have a huge temple or something. And instead, go down to the river and make an offering. I had a chance to talk about this kind of stuff at a Pagan Pride Day in Fort Collins, Colorado. I think it was 2019. It was right before the event. And, there's a river that flows through Fort Collins called the Kashlapudra. And I went to high school there. And back then, the river higher up was good for fishing, but the part that flowed through town was sort of ignored. And, it was junky, it was hard to get to, and so on. Now they've done a lot with environmental cleanup and accessibility. But at the same time, I realized as I was at the Pagan Pride, I was at a park that I knew well from when I was a kid. And the park is only like 3 blocks from the river. And I was saying to guys, this is an opportunity. At the end of the festival, get your drums, get your instruments, make up a floating wreath or something, march over to that street there, hit the button on the crosswalk, and process down to the river and thank her and do something. Toss biodegradable offerings into the water. I mean, that's an old thing people have done in many, many places. And we should be doing it here too, instead of just staying within the safe confines of this city park with our booths and shit. Get it out in the street. Get stuff out in the street that at worst people will think is quaint, and some of them might actually get it. Some of the people in Greece have started doing that. The reconstructed Greek religion. I mean, on the festival of Dionysus, they do the Dionysus procession in Athens. They just do it. They go down the street, this whole group of people in costume with music. They go through sidewalk cafes. It may be raining. They do it anyway. And a lot of the response to the people who see it is like, oh, wow. Yeah, we used to do that. You know? And I think that's, so I think that, yeah, that's one of the things I preach. And the other thing I preach is trying to find things in your site, in your area, that you can kind of quietly repaganize, festivals and stuff.
Yeah.
So I think I find myself thinking more about local stuff now and less thinking about, well, what pantheon should I be following?
That's wonderful advice. Thank you so much. We are out of time. Chaz, thank you so much for this wealth of knowledge and the story is really, really appreciated. You spending time with us this afternoon or this morning, depending on where you're at. Everyone, thank you so much for joining us. This presentation will be available. The recording will be available once Holly gets that up and running. And again, thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you all very, very much.
I'm going to stop the recording. Let's see.